Hello everyone, welcome to Brilliant and Accessible User Experience at Scale. As Faran said, I'm Steve Persch, lead developer advocate at Pantheon. You can find me all over the internet. So Brilliant and Accessible User Experience at Scale is a very ambitious sounding title for a presentation. I'd just like to break down what I mean by those words, what I'll be covering over the course of this presentation. So I'll start with the accessibility part. There's many technical definitions of accessibility around compliance with screen readers, color contrasts. I won't be diving as much into the technical nature of accessibility. I'll talk more broadly and metaphorically about whether or not the tools we build are usable by the people they are meant for. One idea we heard about early this morning is the idea of building platforms on top of platforms on top of platforms. And I'll be talking about that idea as well. In order to do that well, in order to make a platform that is usable by the next layer up, we need to imagine what it is like to be that person. It helps even more if we have been in the job that we are serving. For myself, I started as a theater major, started building sites for theater companies. One of the things that made that job easier for me was I knew the needs of theater companies. One of my first jobs out of college was working in the marketing department for a theater company. I was in the role that I later started serving as a web developer, making Drupal sites for those people in the marketing department. The brilliant part of the title, perhaps even more difficult to pin down when it comes to user experience. I think not only are we trying to fulfill the expectations of the people using the next layer of the platform, ideally we want to surprise and delight them. That I think can make a brilliant user experience. Ideally, we want to be building tools that are as fast to use as the people one layer above us think. Josh talked about the idea that when a website takes 2 seconds or more to load, we're interrupting the thought process of the person using that website. That person is going to get frustrated if their thoughts are interrupted. Ideally, we want to be building tools that move at the speed of the thought of the people using those tools. And at scale, I simply mean at a large enough number where you can no longer deal with individual instances. So Yale has well over 1,000 websites. That means it's pretty difficult to spend large amounts of time on any one of those sites. We need to, for many of those sites, deal with them in larger and larger groups. So the cloud is a big part of this world. The cloud is a fluffy metaphor. Clouds by their nature are ever moving, they're ever changing. I don't feel like this is a great metaphor for the kinds of tools that we want. If we're talking about building platforms on top of platforms on top of platforms, we probably don't want them made of fluff. We probably don't want them moving from underneath them. But the cloud felt like a good metaphor when I was earlier in my web development career, and I felt like the question of hosting, where's this website I'm going to build, where's it going to live, that felt like a dark cloud hanging over many of the projects that I worked on. In my last job, I was working at a major Drupal development agency, and I would work on one project at a time, one site, followed by the next site, followed by the next site. And when it came time for me to be a tech lead for the first time, lead a project, I was working for a fine arts boarding school, high school, performance venue, radio station, and it felt like a high-pressure situation for me acting as a tech lead for the first time. I had to be worried about all of the needs of this institution. I had to be worried about executing a long list of requirements on time, on budget. And there's a potential that where this site is going to live would be just a dark cloud hanging over the project. But that was the first project that I put on Pantheon. By putting that project on Pantheon, it felt like we're building on top of a stable base. That is one dark cloud hanging over the project that I no longer have to worry about. It is now a solid foundation that we're building on top of. I didn't always have that much confidence in the computer systems that I was working with. Who has seen the white screen of death working with a website? So the white screen of death is what happens when you make a coding error. You leave off a trailing semicolon, you leave off a closing parenthesis, you leave off of some syntax error, and you get no feedback whatsoever from the website. You just get a plain white screen that tells you you have done something wrong, but you don't know what. I got this screen a lot in my early web development career because I was working as a freelancer. I've been a theater major. I didn't have any formal training, and I learned by mistakes often. I spent way too long working with the white screen of death because I didn't know I'm supposed to turn on error reporting. If I turn on error reporting, that's going to tell me exactly the line number where the problem is. I was inefficiently using my computer systems. I wanted to be thinking on the level of my client's needs, what they're ultimately going to do with this website, and I'm thinking many, many layers below that because I need to be concentrating line by line, character by character on not making any syntax errors. That was a very bad place to be in. If you ever find yourself in that place, talk to your coworkers. You want to be thinking on higher levels than that. Similarly, just keeping Drupal core up to date. This is a small screenshot of the recommended ways of updating Drupal core. If you go to Drupal.org right now, this is what you'll see for updating Drupal 7. And there are 4 different options, which I think is bad. I think it's bad that there are 4 different options. When I was early in my web development career, there were not 4 options. There was 1, but it was 12 steps long. It was 12 steps long, and it involved many command line flags. It seemed very error prone. I, as the freelance web developer, wanted to be thinking, I'm keeping my sites up to date. All I'm doing is keeping these sites secure. That seems like a discrete task. But instead, what I'm doing is reading through 12 steps of documentation, worrying about command line flags, feeling like I could mess this up in any number of ways. I felt like I was thinking at the wrong level. And the end result was that I was often slow to apply security updates. Sidebar menus are a place where I also felt like I'd spent way too much time early in my career. The first site I maintained, flat HTML files. It was not a CMS-driven site. It was a theater company's website that had evolved over many years to add more and more flat HTML files. And there were sidebars that were somewhat consistent in, say, the education department. So I would get a request, something like, add this new page to the education department section of the website. A simple enough request, should have been easy enough to do in a small amount of time. But instead of thinking on that level, I'm thinking on the level of what the education department needs, I was thinking on the level of, why do these 20 different HTML pages have slightly different menus? I ended up doing hours of forensics without a version control system, trying to figure out why did these sidebars change and reconcile those changes. Eventually, I replaced that with PHP includes, and eventually I replaced it with Drupal, and that helped me think on the level that I wanted to be thinking at. Another place in my career where it felt like I was thinking on the wrong level was when I was working for a startup that was entirely reliant on a big Drupal 6 site. It was a site where members of the public were signing in, they're uploading important files, and this is business critical to the startup. If this Drupal 6 site goes down, their business is basically dead. And I, along with a team of not experienced enough Drupal developers, broke that site in any number of ways, and we quickly realized if we keep breaking this site, if we keep deploying changes that cause regressions, that cause people to not be able to create accounts or get the white screen of death, we're going to lose our jobs. So we started writing down on Post-it notes, these are the things we need to test every time we do a deployment. And that list grew and grew and grew. Eventually, it became a 45-minute list. It took 45 minutes for a person to execute this big list of bullet points that we had printed out, taped on the walls. We're doing a deployment of nearly any size. A person now needs to go through all of these steps, try and create content of different types, try and register a new user account. So we wanted to be thinking on the level of building new functionality that would grow this business. Instead, we're thinking on the level of, well, now I need to execute a 45-minute QA script. And that's going to take away 45 minutes from building new features. I knew computers could help me with that. I knew automated testing was a thing that could do that for me, but I didn't have the expertise. I didn't have the experience to allow me to think on that level. Instead, I had to be the computer executing the same 45-minute script over and over again. So in thinking about platforms on top of platforms, in thinking about what levels on which do I want to spend my time, I'm reminded of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is an idea that comes out of psychology, the idea that human beings tend to organize our needs into certain levels. That first and foremost, we need to have our physiological needs met. We need food, we need water, we need shelter. Once we have that locked down, we tend to be worried about safety, physical safety, psychological safety. We then start to worry about belonging. Do we have a place in society, friends and family? Where do we fit in? And then, do we feel good about that place? Do we feel good about ourselves? Ultimately, we want to be self-actualized. And this metaphor is not perfect. It doesn't necessarily apply to all people or all cultures, but I think it's a fairly good starting point for understanding how human beings organize their priorities. I think we can apply this same idea of a hierarchy of needs to websites. I've written blog posts where I apply it just to website performance or just to DevOps. Today I'll be applying it to websites writ large. At a baseline level, if we're going to have Drupal and WordPress sites, we need servers that can run those Drupal and WordPress sites. At one point in Yale's history, there was a physical room where you could see the servers that were running those sites. There it is on someone's desk. That's the server. You need security. Those servers need to be kept secure. They need to be kept up to date. Same thing with the Drupal and WordPress software. We need to comply with any number of rules and regulations. Now we have GDPR as a set of rules that we need to comply with around privacy and personal information. We need to comply with legal guidelines around accessibility. We need to comply with the visual guidelines that John was talking about in the last section. Once we know that we're not doing anything wrong, that the site is at least not wrong, we can start to worry about, is it any good? It's hard to worry about whether or not it's good if we're simply violating a baseline rule. And then on top of quality, we can ask, is it serving its actual purpose? Different sections of a university website are going to have different purposes. Some are meant to drive undergraduate enrollment. Some are meant to drive alumni giving. Lots of measures of conversions, especially in the university space. But it's hard to even think on the level of conversion if your website is down because of a denial of service attack. It's hard to think on that level if you aren't complying with the branding guidelines and you're getting emails telling you that the logos need to be fixed. Each of these levels can be addressed with mechanization to some degree. Historically, it's people. It's people on all the levels. Like Josh's slide showed, with human beings literally stacked on top of one another. Traditionally, the way large enterprises, large institutions address each of these layers is you could name the people who are responsible for each of these layers. But machines can help. AWS is probably the easiest example of the way software helps solve one of these layers. So rather than having to worry about the physical room where the servers are, that physical room that needs to be kept at a certain temperature, just at lunch I was talking with David Gerger. He was telling me about when there were physical servers on Yale's campus that ran the Drupal sites. They had to worry about the temperature of that room, and the air conditioning goes out. That's not the level on which David wants to be thinking, I imagine. One way to think about this is balancing authority and responsibility. David might want the authority to control certain aspects of the way the servers are managed, but does he want the responsibility of keeping that room at a certain temperature? I don't think so. I don't think many people want that responsibility. AWS offers to take the difficult parts of responsibility over for you. But they give you the authority to control so many different layers. This is a screenshot of Amazon Web Services dashboard from over a year ago. If you were to look at it now, it would be even more overwhelming. It wouldn't even fit on one screen. I think this is too many options if what you want to do is run Drupal and WordPress websites. This is not a helpful layer of abstraction if that's what you want to do. I think Pantheon comes in as a much better abstraction layer on top of something like AWS. We happen to use Google Cloud for any number of reasons that you can read about on our website. The short answer is that Google is the home of Kubernetes, the state of the art when it comes to containerization technology, and that's a big part of our platform. So Pantheon is built on top of another platform that is most concerned with that server layer. We offer many tools and services that I think can be viewed through the lens of security. So let's talk about some of those things. First, comparing Pantheon's architecture to traditional hosting architecture. You've got shared hosting on one end of the spectrum where you're putting as many sites onto one server as possible. And this carries with it any number of security risks. A hacked site in a shared hosting model can lead to many hacked sites. By not doing it this way, Pantheon increases security. Single virtual machines offer better isolation, less likely to have a hacked site leading to many hacked sites, but still the problem of, say, denial of service attacks or a benevolent spike in traffic. With a single virtual machine, you're going to have a hard time handling a large spike in traffic. That can be viewed as a security problem. Moving up a chain, custom clusters. This is where many of the founders of Pantheon spent their time before starting Pantheon, building very large sites and often working with the direct tools of AWS to figure out exactly how to run those sites at a large scale. But it can start to feel like this for any institution running a large number of sites. Simply too many server configurations to keep track of, too many ways to deploy sites in a way that's not giving us what we want. So Pantheon simplifies things with containerization. I'll try and speed through these slides a little bit faster because there's more stuff I want to talk about on top of Pantheon. So to just run through our architecture really quick, we start with an edge layer. This is now a global edge layer like Josh mentioned. HTTPS termination happens here. Full page caching happens here. The idea is that you want to get a response out of this layer in, say, a single millisecond, rather than waiting for Drupal or WordPress to spend an entire whole second generating HTML. Moving past that edge layer, we have a runtime matrix of PHP containers. This is where Drupal and WordPress actually live. They talk to a database container, which can scale out horizontally. Redis is available as an object cache, again, to help sites run faster. Apache Solr for faster, more accurate search results, and Valhalla is what we call our custom-written file system that handles things like uploaded images, uploaded PDFs, and works well with this containerized architecture. The global CDN, again, these are the points of presence spread out around the world. The idea is that if you're in Asia, if you're in Australia, you get a cached response from a point of presence, a POP, on the same continent. Gives you a much faster page load time than you get if you're going all the way across the world. You also get HTTP2 and HTTPS just baked in at this level with auto renewal of certificates. Going more directly at the idea of security, rather than following 12 steps to update Drupal 7, you just press a button, and that is how core updates are brought in. The basic idea of our platform is that every site needs at least 3 environments: a live environment where you connect your domain name, your real database is running in that live environment, and you have 1 or more development environments on the other end of the spectrum where developers can reconfigure modules, they can do some theming work, and at some point we need to bring our code changes up from the dev environments and test them in the test environment before they go to the live environment. Multi-dev as well, I think, could be a big differentiator for Yale. If you need to work on a new theme or do some long-running bit of changes, you can spin up basically another development environment, tie it to a Git branch, do whatever changes you need to do, and not step on the toes of the other people in your team. Spinning those up is very, very simple in our dashboard. Adding people to sites or adding people to organizations, also very simple to do in the Pantheon dashboard. Our command line tool, I think, starts to move up the hierarchy from safety into the level of belonging. This is a tool that can help make sure that Pantheon belongs with Yale, belongs with your pre-existing workflows, belongs with your pre-existing architecture. As a command line tool, it's an easy point for doing some custom scripting if necessary to make sure that our platform plays well with your pre-existing tool set. Similarly, Quicksilver is what we call our system for adding on additional scripts to things like deployments. If it's a part of your team's culture to notify everyone on the team anytime a deployment is made, you can automate that with Quicksilver, sending, say, a Slack message anytime a deployment is made. The custom upstream model, again, is how changes can be distributed out from the central Yale sites repository to the thousands of different sites, each with their own dev, test, and live environment. This gives you the ability to say one site within Yale sites needs to be a little bit special. It has its own Git repository. It can have its own developer dedicated to making that site somehow special in the Yale sites ecosystem. All right, so this is the section that I want to spend a little bit more time on. I was talking with some people at the welcome session last night. How can computers help with compliance and quality? How can we help make the jobs easier for the people who live at this layer of the hierarchy? So we've got servers and security largely handled by Google Cloud and Pantheon. How can we get a computer to get us in compliance? So one of the things we need to comply with, again, is the Yale branding guidelines. Is it possible for a computer to look at any one site and tell us whether or not we are in compliance? One of the things we need to comply with specifically is the Yale logo should never be combined with other designs to form a new or hybrid logo. The logo and signature should always be linked to the main Yale website. This is a pretty clear rule. We should be able to have a computer look at this rule and look at any Yale site and tell us whether or not we're in compliance. Well, can a computer do this? I think it depends on your definition of computer. In the movie Hidden Figures, we recently got a pop culture lesson in the history of the word computer. So in this movie, we met Mary, Catherine, and Dorothy, and they work as human computers at NASA. It's their job to take the work product of different people at NASA who are doing all kinds of mathematical operations, and it's their job to let the wider system know whether or not that work product is in compliance with the rules everyone has agreed to. Now, it's not visual branding rules in their case, it's the laws of mathematics. They may find that someone has mixed up sine and cosine, and all the rest of the work product can't be trusted. We meet Catherine Johnson as the main character, and we learn that she's one of the best computers in the department. What makes her special as a computer is because she's able to work on multiple levels at once. She's able to be much more than a human computer. The goal that NASA is trying to achieve, what they have at the top of their pyramid, is putting a human being into space and returning that human being alive at the end. So she starts at this level of compliance, making sure that this work product is in compliance with the laws of analytic geometry, but she's able to work at higher levels as well. She's able to start thinking creatively about how are we going to put this human being into space and return him back alive. That alive part we could put at the quality or conversion level. It might be easier to put a human being into space, but exert so many G-forces on that person that the person dies. This movie is of course made dramatic because Catherine has her own personal hierarchy of needs being knocked out from under her. She's working in a society, in a culture that through racism and sexism is basically attacking her own feeling of personal safety. It's even intruding on her own physiological needs to use the bathroom. So that's what makes the movie dramatic. It's unreasonable to expect the people that you work with to be Catherine Johnson levels of intelligence and resilience. It's unreasonable to ask any one person to think on all levels at once. How can we get computers to address some of these lower levels? So the Lego block metaphor is a popular metaphor in web development. It's the way that I've used, it's the thing I've used to explain my job for a decade to friends and family who ask how I went from being a theater major to being a web developer. I say, well, I love playing with Legos, and it's just like that. I have Drupal modules, I have WordPress plugins, I combine them, and hey, it's Lego blocks. I don't think this metaphor works very well anymore, especially for front-end development. If we want to think about what are the Lego blocks of front-end development, the latest way we're thinking about Lego blocks in front-end development is the idea of design components. So what we're looking at here is a screenshot from Pattern Lab. This is one of the popular ways right now. I heard some Yale people mention it yesterday. One of the popular ways of defining what our building blocks are for front-end development. So we should be able to ask a computer, is this Yale site, is this Drupal or WordPress site in compliance with our style guide, with our design components? That should be a question we can ask a computer. Unfortunately, it's hard to ask a computer that question because in practice, the way design systems get implemented in Drupal is by using one or many of Drupal's layers. Drupal has, I think, too many layers for deciding what your Lego blocks are if you're thinking in terms of design components for front-end developments. There's hook theme, which is maybe the most natural and the oldest metaphor, but many people don't use that directly. There's template overrides, there's pre-processing functions. I won't read through them all. There are simply too many ways to translate one definition of your Lego blocks into Drupal. So to take a specific example, I took this screenshot off of Drupal.org. This is from my own bio page on Drupal.org. This is a pretty simple component. If we want to think in terms of Lego blocks, there's not much going on here. We have current roles, and that's in bold. We have my job title underneath that, and underneath that we have an image that's linked to Pantheon's own profile page. If we're thinking in terms of the Lego blocks that we're building our sites with, this should be a pretty simple Lego block. We don't need much more than a bold or a strong tag to wrap current roles. The font is probably coming from something global. We maybe need a line break in between current roles and lead developer advocate, and maybe a line break or just wrappers between lead developer advocate and the image. Anyone want to take a guess at the number of wrapping divs in between current roles and lead developer advocate? It's not a BR tag. That maybe would be the simplest way to do it. It is some number of divs in between these two elements. 10? Anyone else have a guess? 4? 7. 7 divs separating current roles and lead developer advocate. And each of these divs has a purpose. Drupal, for many historical reasons, tends to translate each level of data hierarchy, as Drupal understands it in its data model, to wrapping divs, to CSS classes. And we liked it that way. We liked it that way maybe 10 years ago. There were reasons we did it this way. But if what you want to be doing is thinking in terms of Lego blocks, front-end components that are not at all specific to Drupal, after all we know, Yale sites will now be supporting WordPress. Ideally, we've got the same Lego blocks in both places for our front-end components. But if you've got 7 wrapping divs coming from Drupal, those are getting in your way. A couple years ago, I did a presentation about rendering HTML with Drupal, and I said it's more like playing Plinko. You drop in your data on the back end of Drupal, it flows through a bunch of levels, and out comes 7 layers or more of wrapping divs, and hopefully you get what you want, but probably not. So I think a better metaphor is sketching and sculpting for the reality of the way Drupal front-end development has worked historically. I don't think we've been playing with Lego blocks with the majority of Drupal's theming history. There are some people who looked at those 7 layers of wrapping divs and said, this is awful. I hate all of it. I want to start with a blank slate. So they opened up a fresh template file and they sketch exactly the markup they want. You can do that. Not many people did, but you can do that. There have been people doing that in Drupal for a decade or more. I think a closer metaphor for the reality of most Drupal theming over the last decade is sculpting. You get those 7 wrapping divs, that's like a rough shape in clay, and it is your job as the front-end developer to shape that clay, maybe shave away parts you don't want, maybe apply paint or something to the clay sculpture, and that's, I think just a closer metaphor to what we've been doing. The trouble is, we've got over 1,000 Yale sites. If each of those is a clay sculpture that is being sculpted individually, there's no way we can expect consistency. So if you want more history here, you can check out a presentation I did 3 years ago, rendering HTML with Drupal, past, present, and future for more historical context there. But the goal going forward is to work with these style guides to get consistency. So I'd quickly like to run through some of the ways style guides can go bad. That I've seen over the last about 5 years. So you start with something like Pattern Lab. I think that may be a tool already in use at Yale. You start with Pattern Lab, and that is where you are defining exactly the CSS and the markup that you want. That is sketches of individual elements, exactly as you want them. But then at some point, those get approved. Someone approves those components and says, yes, those are ready to go. They're handed off to perhaps a Drupal or WordPress expert who copies all of the CSS into a Drupal or WordPress theme and starts looking at the Drupal or WordPress markup and basically starts changing stuff. Hopefully keeping the end visual output the same, but perhaps not. Living style guide was kind of the buzzword as this idea came into being, but in practice it was often zombie style guides. The style guide in Pattern Lab or something like it would get approved, but as soon as the implementation started in Drupal or WordPress, that was the new canonical implementation, because that is what was actually driving the website. If someone says, oh, this one element is wrong, are you going to go fix it in both places? Maybe, if you have time. But in practice, these two things start to diverge, and you don't have a living style guide, you have a zombie style guide. The Drupal community is starting to deal with this in lots of different ways. A couple years ago, the way I started to deal with this problem was I decided the CSS, at least, can be exactly the same. Let's have an automated process that's going to take exactly the same CSS from our style guide and put exactly the same CSS into Drupal. The markup may be close or close enough, but we'll know that it's visually identical because we're using exactly the same CSS. But of course, the markup is just as important. So over the years, over the last really 4 to 5 years, the Drupal community has built up a tool. This is one of many that serves this purpose, called Emulsify. And the basic idea here is it lets you set up Pattern Lab in such a way where exactly the same twig files, exactly the same markup can be used both in your pattern library and in Drupal. Exactly the same CSS as well, exactly the same JavaScript. Better still, but I'm worried that this is not good enough when you have Drupal and WordPress. This system is set up for Drupal. I'm concerned if you tried to apply the same system to WordPress, you would end up with all kinds of problems. So I think where we're going as web developers is towards tools like React, towards tools like Polymer web components. I think these are much better fulfillments of the idea of Lego blocks. If that's the metaphor we want to stick with for how we're doing front-end development, then we need to be able to define those front-end development Lego blocks in ways that are not tied to any one back-end system. Because there'll be departments switching from Drupal to WordPress and back again. You shouldn't have to throw out all of the front-end development work that has been done when you switch back-end systems. So if you're interested in the latest and greatest in at least using Emulsify, here's a session from Twin Cities Drupal Camp last week, component-based theming with with UI patterns and Pattern Lab. I would like to get into WordPress a little bit here, especially because I think a lot of people might be using it for the first time here at Yale. WordPress is adding something called the Gutenberg editor. They have completely reimagined what a WYSIWYG editor will look like. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because I think it shows that the WordPress community is much more in tune with the needs of actual content editors. The Drupal community tends to prioritize the needs of site builders, the needs of developers. The Drupal community is not as good at thinking one level up, thinking who is actually using the platform that is Drupal. The WordPress community tends to be much better at thinking about who is actually interacting with the WordPress site all day, every day as part of their job. So they built the Gutenberg editor, a brand new WYSIWYG, that they hope will be a better fulfillment of the expectations of content editors that actually have to work with WordPress sites. So we see it has bold and italics like any WYSIWYG would. It has the ability to change colors, which makes me nervous as someone who primarily comes from the Drupal community. I worry about giving over control of colors at the paragraph level element or at the word by word level. But one nice touch here is warning people if they've chosen a color combination that's bad for accessibility. I think that's a nice touch. That is a surprising, delightful, perhaps brilliant touch. It's a better fulfillment of just the idea of a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. For the WYSIWYGs that have been built in Drupal and WordPress the last 10 years, often we don't see what we're going to get. If you were to do something like a Google Maps embed in Drupal or WordPress right now, but before Gutenberg, what you might have is a square brackets reference to a Google map. And you just have to know inside of that square bracket what all these width and height and zoom level parameters are. With Gutenberg, you just see it. You just see what you're going to get. Adding images seems much easier in Gutenberg. In this case, adding a gallery of images with captions, I'm able to use basically a keyboard shortcut and just type /IMA, and that auto-completes to image, and I can add an image. And then I can convert that image to a gallery. That's something that would be very difficult to do in Drupal, convert one type of content to another. But WordPress prioritize that need, I think, because they're more in tune with the expectations of actual content editors. The idea behind Gutenberg is that everything is a block. Rather than thinking at the level of individual document elements, we're basically thinking about a new level, a new Lego block metaphor, where every paragraph tag, every button, every block quote, every YouTube embed, every cover image is a Gutenberg block. I think this will make it much easier for the Yale Sites team to say, okay, we have this design library, we have all of the front-end components that we expect any Yale site to be able to have. Each of those things now needs to be Gutenberg blocks. Implementing them in Drupal, you have to decide, is that a view mode? Is it a view style plugin? Is it a view row plugin? Is it a field formatter? There are too many options. With Gutenberg, you'll have just Gutenberg blocks. Every single design component you make in your library will probably become a Gutenberg block. You can have blocks inside of other blocks with columns. There's the idea of static blocks, basically where the HTML that you would expect for a heading or a paragraph is just what's saved to the database. There's also the idea of dynamic blocks, where if you have something like a block that is a list of the most recent posts, by default, you have 5 recent posts in one column. So in this case, what I'm doing is changing the number of posts to 6 and the number of columns to 2. So what gets stored in the database is simply, it's the latest blocks, it's 6 of them, and it's in 2 columns. You can make blocks reusable, shareable, convert any block to something reusable, embed it in another page, update it once, it'll update everywhere. Also the idea of templates. So WordPress has the idea of post types, like Drupal has content types. You can predefine fields that get filled in by Gutenberg. The data model is probably the most controversial part for a Drupal audience anyway. All of these blocks get stored in the body field. Every single block is just inline in the body field with HTML comments wrapping the block to say what type of block it is. There are things like the cover image that then contain serialized JSON right in the HTML comment. That makes me a little nervous, but the WordPress community has very good, very strong reasons for why they did it this way. The WordPress community is focused on democratizing publishing. And it's their opinion that by storing all of this data just in the body field, they keep themselves in line with the WordPress community's expectations. The expectations are that the body field is the most important thing. It's the reason you're on this admin UI at all. Let's try and keep that body field as comprehensible as possible to as wide of an audience as possible. All right, I've got 10 minutes here to just run through some quick ideas of how we can use computers to help us address some of these levels. A very easy one, if you're interested in automated testing, one of the easiest automated tests to add is PHP code sniffing. If you've decided we're going to follow the Drupal PHP coding standards, you can have a computer tell you whether or not you are doing so. A very easy automated test to add. Visual regression testing is something that Yale is already using. This is something that will allow the migration process to take a screenshot of the live site as it exists now on Acquia, take a screenshot of the site as it exists on Pantheon, verify that they're visually identical, and that's a strong indication that the site is still functioning. It didn't break in the migration process. This is also incredibly helpful for security updates. The first time I used visual regression testing, I was applying a large number of module updates to Drupal. And on one content type, on one view mode, one field started printing twice because I had updated Panelizer module. Had I just clicked around the site, I wouldn't have noticed that. I would have waited days or weeks for someone to email me and say, hey, did you know that on this one page, this one field is printing twice? And then I would have to go fix it. By having a computer take screenshots of two versions of the website, I found that immediately because it was the only visual difference out of 2 or 3 dozen pages. The Google Vision API. This is something that I think will be able to fit into editorial processes. So 1,000 websites. How do we know that there are no potentially offensive, potentially inappropriate images on any Yale sites? Are there any images uploaded on any Yale site that might need some kind of manual review, some kind of discussion about whether or not this image is appropriate? The Google Vision API has a way to bring images to your attention. We're working on some proof of concept work to show how this can be tied into Drupal's, at least, editorial workflows. Captions are another thing that can be easy to forget, but they're important for accessibility, alt tags on images. One way I've heard of thinking about artificial intelligence, anything that a person can think in under a second, artificial intelligence can probably do. So if a person can think of at least a decent starting point alt description of an image, a computer can probably fill that in for you, and then it's your job as the editor to decide, is this correct or not? If it's right, you don't need to edit it. It saves you a few seconds that can add up the more images you have to maintain. Are our sites staying fast? This is something that again, often gets addressed through manual labor. Are our sites fast? Are they accessible? Are they following any number of best practices? Google has recently released a tool called Lighthouse that is designed to give you a 0 to 100 score on any number of metrics, mainly performance, accessibility, best practices, and compliance with progressive web app standards. So it's not perfect. It's not going to remove all manual labor, but it can give you a nice indication of whether or not your sites are getting slow. Has this new feature that just got added to the site made the site significantly slower? If your performance score in Lighthouse drops from 90 to 70, that's a strong indication that there's manual review that needs to be done. But if your Lighthouse scores stay exactly the same, that tells you you probably don't need to do a manual review of performance considerations of the new change. So we are hoping to move up the chain. I hope that as we return to this conference in the years to come, I'll have a stronger answer to how can machines help us at the highest levels of conversions. But for the time being, I think we can start by making sure our platforms are solid, our platforms on top of our platforms are solid, and that we're building tools that fulfill the expectations of the people we're focused on. Thank you.